Good evening. Thank you for braving the bomb cyclone to join us tonight. I'm Eduardo Peñalver. I'm the president of Seattle University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our campus, if you're not from our campus, for tonight's talk by Professor Gary Marcus. The developments in various fields of artificial intelligence over the past 2 years have been remarkable. The emergence of new generative AI tools promises to enable technological applications that were previously unimaginable for many of us. And even those of us who have been skeptical of the capability of this technology in the past, and I will count myself among those, have noted these recent developments, and they've really forced us to do that. The capabilities of the newest text generators and image generators are undeniably impressive. At the same time, these new technologies, with their reliance on massive data sets scraped from the internet, their large language model architecture, raise a whole host of ethical, legal, epistemological, and aesthetic questions that demand our sustained attention. With our aggregation of disciplines and our commitment to exploring the edges of knowledge and fearlessly pursuing the truth, universities are precisely the place to probe these questions. And with our focus on wedding knowledge and wisdom, technical expertise, and values, Jesuit universities are especially well-positioned to do that. For 5 centuries, the Jesuit educational model has promoted discernment and helped our students to hone their skills in critical thinking, problem-solving, communication, and leadership. And far from undermining the value of these skills, emergent AI technologies, I think, only underscore their importance for the education of our future leaders. What these new AI technologies do challenge, however, are our assumptions about what those skills entail, what imparting those skills requires. And as the Jesuit University here in Seattle, a global hub for AI research and applications, it's a central expression of the mission of Seattle University to be a leader in convening top thinkers from industry and academia to explore the leading edge of AI developments through multidisciplinary lenses of technology, ethics, law, and policy. And tonight's talk is very much in keeping with that mission. Our hope is that conversations like the one you will hear this evening will help you deepen your own understanding of AI, both its possibilities and its limits. Thank you again for being here, and it's now my privilege to turn the podium over to the leader of Seattle University's Tech Ethics Initiative and our host for tonight's talk, Professor Onur Bakiner.
Well, hello, everyone. Again, thank you for being here. It's such a privilege to host this event, host Professor Marcus with all of you in attendance. So I would like to introduce our guest and get to it right away. Gary Marcus is a leading voice in artificial intelligence. He's a scientist, best-selling author, and serial entrepreneur. And he is well known for his challenges to contemporary AI, anticipating many of the current limitations decades in advance, and for his research in human language development and cognitive neuroscience. So he's the author of several books, including The Algebraic Mind, Cluj, which I've read, by the way, and I can't recommend enough. The Birth of the Mind, and The Guitar Zero. I'm going to ask about that. He has often contributed to The New Yorker, Wired, and The New York Times. And on our short walk here, told me that he's been interviewed by the BBC, ACM, and what was the third one?
Time.
And Time.
Seems arriving yesterday.
Between yesterday and today. So. Very prolific public intellectual, and his latest book before this one was Rebooting AI, and again, that one I think sort of sets the tone for sort of some of the more critical approaches to the research, development, and use of AI. Today we're going to talk more about taming Silicon Valley, how we can ensure that AI works for us. Maybe a word or two, just personally, I think I first saw Professor Marcus on Twitter, and then sort of, on Substack, having read his sort of thoughtful reflections on artificial intelligence today, made me think that it's, he's controversial in the good sense of the term. I think lately we use the term a little bit sort of, incorrectly. Anybody who stirs a fight is controversial. It's not that. In its original, it's contra, against and virtual, sort of, turning against. And so there is a quality of being sort of against the grain, and through that sparking thoughtful dialogue. And that is exactly what I think Gary Marcus does as a public intellectual. So without further ado, I would like to invite him on stage.
Hang on.
Yeah. Right. So the first question is coming directly from the book. You call today's problems with AI, and I'm quoting, the perfect storm of corporate irresponsibility, widespread deployment, lack of adequate regulation, and inherent unreliability. So can you explain a little bit more?
All while the bomb cyclone looms, right? It's the bomb cyclone of AI, right? I've loved AI since I was a child, and most of what AI has historically done, I haven't had too much issue with. So, for example, if somebody uses a GPS navigation system to plot a route around a crazy city like Seattle, where there is no grid or there's parts of multiple grids that intersect or whatever, that's fine. There's no great risk there. I mean, I used that to navigate your city today while I was walking around, and it didn't do anything particularly harmful. I don't think it was bad for society that I used a GPS navigation system. And a lot of what AI has historically aspired to is advancing science and technology, and I think those are worthy goals. But especially with the advent of ChatGPT, I think things have shifted a lot around the pursuit of money. AI started mostly as a research question, like just how could we do this? I don't think people thought necessarily they were going to get rich. They thought they'd get some grant dollars for sure, but it was a scientific question. How do we make a machine that is similar to natural intelligence? How do we do that? And it shifted, especially over the last couple of years, to how can we justify spending billions and billions of dollars on chips? How are we actually going to profit from this? And that has, I think, changed the moral outlook. That's one piece of it. Another piece is that current AI techniques that are popular, generative AI, they're not actually that reliable. So, some of the technologies we've used for computation are extremely reliable. So pocket calculators, I mean, nobody even uses one anymore, but we have them on our phone. But calculators always give you the right answer. Like, we expect them never to make a mistake. Large language models, we give them a free pass. Some people in this room will be old enough to remember the Pentium chip had a controversy. It was a huge scandal. They lost $500 million. It was in the front pages of the newspaper because it made a mistake on floating point arithmetic, not integers, but floating point arithmetic, something like once in every trillion computations. And people were hopping mad, right? How could Intel be so irresponsible as to release something that could once in a while make an arithmetic error? Large language models, if you ask them to do arithmetic, can't even, reliably do floating point arithmetic at all, even on, 12-digit times 12-digit multiplication, which any calculator would kind of eat for breakfast, they make mistakes. So you have this technology that's unreliable. Lots of people are pushing it. Some of it is like a fear that the US will be beaten out by China, and there are different narratives, but everybody's rushing ahead with this thing that is not at all reliable. It's also not responsible. So, for example, people are using large language models to evaluate job candidates. So they get thousands of applicants for one job, they throw it into an LLM, and we know that LLMs, and we kind of have some understanding of why, we know LLMs are biased. So, they're going to give a better score to a white male typically than to anybody else. We have laws in our country that forbid discrimination, but these systems are doing it anyway. So it's very irresponsible, but by and large, society is giving them a free pass because people are so excited about these systems. You could ask why they're excited about them. You know, they're fun to play with and so forth. But I don't think that that justifies the risks that we're taking with these systems. So all at once, and the other part was widespread deployment. You know, the underlying technology for large language models, which is what everybody's talking about now, it goes back to 2017, and its historical roots actually go back much further, you know, arguably to the 1950s or even 40s. But this specific architecture goes back to 2017. And when it was just in the lab, I didn't really care. It's like we have 20 different approaches to AI at that point. And it was just one of them. I wasn't particularly enamored of it, but you know, in the lab, it'd be fine. But suddenly ChatGPT was deployed to 100 million people. And you know, every company is trying to put it in its workflow despite all these problems and so forth. So that was the widespread deployment. So you have all of this at once, and the companies really changed their attitudes. Like, I don't know if I can say this in the Seattle area, but Microsoft used to really care about responsible AI. Some people will remember Tay. Tay was a early chatbot, not the earliest, which goes back to Eliza, which was before I was born, but Tay was released in, I think it was 2016 or 17, something like that. And overnight, it started talking like a Nazi, or no, I'm not going to make the joke that's in my head. I'm going to suppress it. You can imagine where I might go. But so it started sounding like a Nazi, and they pulled it off the market in 12 hours. You know, they'd actually built a similar technology in China that had worked without incident, but a bunch of people basically pranked it, and it started saying these horrible things. So Microsoft said, well, that's not responsible. We're going to take this off. It would be good for society. And when you fast forward to 2023, after ChatGPT came out, and remember, Microsoft owns a stake in OpenAI, there was kind of a similar incident. But this time they didn't say, oh, we care about responsible AI. They actually took the opposite attitude. So the incident is Kevin Roose is a reporter for the New York Times. And he had this conversation with Sydney, which was one of the incarnations of ChatGPT, basically, the underlying technology, GPT-4. And it told him to get a divorce and that it was in love with him. It was really crazy stuff. And everybody read it. And I thought, well, within a week or two, they're going to take this off the market and they'll come back after they fix it. Instead, they kind of like put a Band-Aid on, soldiered on. And Satya, the CEO, Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said, we want to make Google dance. And he did. He got Google, who was being very cautious about releasing large language models. They had them too, even though only OpenAI had really released them publicly. Google started rushing around. And so the whole climate changed from, hey, we'll use this stuff in the lab, to we have to get it out as soon as possible or we'll lose market share or whatever. So all of this kind of happened within a month or two of ChatGPT coming out. As people saw that it was a hit, everybody wanted to be in on it, but they lost, I think, their sense of morality and responsibility.
Well, so since you mentioned 2017, so I imagine that's when the transformer architecture with the attention mechanism was sort of released. I think it was Google research initially. So can you talk a little bit more about the technical intricacies here? Like, what is the technical detail that makes today's machine learning-based models unreliable?
So, I mean, their ancestors were also unreliable. A lot of my research, I should say, like, I'm best known right now for my commentary on AI, but my original graduate school training was mostly, not entirely, about how children learn language. And in that context, I started studying neural networks, which are the kind of thing that we're using now. The current systems are descendants of the things that I was studying in graduate school, working with Steven Pinker. So I've been looking at these things for a long time. Basically what they do, and LLMs, large language models, transformers, are better at this than their predecessors, but in many ways still qualitatively similar. What they are doing is they are trying to guess what words a human being would use in a particular context. Not by understanding the ideas there, but just like literally modeling, these words tend to follow the others. The simplest analogy is autocorrect on your phone. You type something, it tries to predict the next word. Well, what I have said is that large language models are basically like autocomplete on steroids. So they're good at doing that, but with limitations. They don't really know what they're talking about. So they will say things that sound statistically plausible that aren't actually plausible in the real world. One of the examples I give in the book is somebody had ChatGPT write a biography of me, not totally unlike people would use to introduce me at a talk. And it came up with this sentence that I like to make piquant observations in order to make my points from my pet chicken, Henrietta. I don't have a pet chicken, Henrietta. And, you know, some of you might imagine that would be a very weird thing to have. It's not completely impossible, but it's pretty implausible. If a human wrote that biography and was paying attention, they might be like, is this really true? And they might do some fact checking. They might like look it up in Wikipedia. Okay, it's not there. Let me do a web search. I don't see anything there. You know, maybe this isn't plausible. Maybe we shouldn't run with this, right? So humans, at least when they're well motivated, can do fact checking. They can do sanity checking. Does this thing make sense? And large language models can't. And so they're just analogizing essentially to stored examples in their database. My favorite current example of this concerns something called river crossing problems, which some of you will know. So river crossing problems, you might see them in like books of mathematical puzzles, and they're kind of logical puzzles. So the canonical one is like, there's a man, there's some cabbage, there's a wolf, there's a boat. You have to get them all across the other side. The wolf might eat the cabbage, et cetera, et cetera. And there are a lot of them on the internet. Remember, importantly, these systems to do any good at all basically have to scrape the entire internet. So they'll come across, I don't know, 100,000 of these problems. So a friend of mine, well, actually, I think Doug Hofstetter, I think, sent me this one, sent me an example, which is a man. So, all right, so I left something out. So the typical answer is like the man goes across, brings the cabbage, goes back, gets the wolf, then he has the wolf and the cabbage. And there's a lot of like back and forth, and you have to like have everything in the right place at the right time. So somebody tested out the system on there's a man and a woman in a boat. They have to get to the other side. And the system comes up with an answer that sounds like all the others, but doesn't make sense in this context. So it's like the man takes the boat by himself across to the other side, swims back, somehow magically manifests the boat. I forget exactly how, and finally brings the woman across the side. I explained this to my 10-year-old, and she said, well, why don't you just get the man and the woman in the boat and go across to the other side? And of course, my 10-year-old was correct. What, you know, ChatGPT or whatever system was not correct. And so you can see in an answer like that, or in the hallucination about my pet chicken, Henrietta, and so on, that what it's doing is it's looking at words, but doesn't understand the meanings of those words. It's just like, in this context. Oh, and I forgot to explain the full story of the pet chicken, Henrietta. So I gave this as an example in a talk in Germany in January. And somebody emails me the next day and says, I figured out why it did this. I'm like, really? I mean, I knew generally, abstractly why it would do this because, you know, statistics, but I didn't know the specifics. So they found that someone had written a book called something like Henrietta Goes to the Store or something like that, which was a children's book. And the illustrator was Gary Oswald. So somehow, like, it was combining these little bits and those little bits and came up with Gary Marcus as pet chicken named Henrietta because Gary Oswald illustrated a book named Henrietta. And then the other part was kind of true, was from real sentences, more or less, using piquant observation. So I just did it now. I use piquant observations from my son and my daughter to illustrate my point. So it was like it had, you know, morphed together the fact that I talk about my kids. I did that, for example, in the New York Times op-ed that many people saw, and I did it for you just now. I can't help myself. I like to talk about my kids, and they're great examples of cognitive machines that actually work, unlike these AI. So it just put together all these little pieces, but it doesn't really understand them, which actually relates to something else, which they also plagiarize a lot. And that's because they're trying to put the pieces, they take everything that they see, they break them into a zillion little pieces, and then at the time that you use them, they reconstruct what's statistically probable among those pieces. So the most statistically probable thing is direct plagiarism. And so they don't always directly plagiarism, but they often do. In the book, I mentioned some research I did earlier this year with an artist, Reed Southen. He works on a lot of famous movies, Marvel movies, whatever. So we did this study together of, I think it was Stable Diffusion and Midjourney. And we came up with examples where you could say things like, draw me an Italian plumber. And what it would come up with, these systems, is Mario from the Nintendo games. right? Like if you had an artist you were paying to work with you and they draw Mario when you say Italian plumber, you will fire them. You'll be like, I don't think you understand. Art is about doing new things, not copying old things. But because of the ways that these systems basically are doing statistically driven reconstruction of things that are common, they kind of, well, I won't say they can't help themselves, but they are prone to plagiarism as well as the hallucinations and so forth. So all of these challenges with them are really inherent in the ways that they work. And you can imagine a whole different way, right? You could imagine that you'd have abstract knowledge about what it means to be Italian and what a plumber is, and you put together that abstract knowledge. Or if you were writing a biography, you might look things up and synthesize what you've seen and so forth. But that's just not what these systems do. They give an illusion to the naive that they're much more sophisticated than they are. But it's like a psychic doing what's called a cold read, where they walk into the room and they convince you that they can read your mind, and it's really just a trick. At some level, it's an illusion.
So, a provocation. When these kinds of issues are brought up in sort of technology discourse, one response coming from the companies producing AI is that, yes, it's not perfect now, but in 5 years' time, it's going to be better, either thanks to advanced compute power or thanks to a breakthrough moment like the ones we had. So, we're at the threshold of something greater. So, what would you make of that?
Well,
comment?
there's a sort of general historical answer and there's a immediate answer. So the general historical answer is people in AI have been promising that AI will come real soon now, to take a phrase from a science fiction writer. I like real soon now for a long time. In fact, since the 1950s. Always there have been promises a few years away. The joke used to be that people would say it was 20 years away because that was like 4 grant cycles. So you get all your money and then you retire. You had a nice career. You're not held responsible. But Elon Musk discovered that you could make the same kinds of promises like 3 years away and still no one would hold you accountable. So he started promising, for example, in 2016 that he would have a driverless car that would go from from LA to New York. That never happened. Nobody cared. It didn't hurt the stock price. So then he went again and he said, he said in 2019, we will have 1 million driverless taxis on the road by 2020. That didn't happen, didn't hurt the stock price. In fact, the stock went up. So he keeps doing this. And Sam Altman, who kind of was close to Elon before they became mortal enemies, learned the same trick. And so he's always saying, we're about to solve physics with AI or whatever. So people keep making these promises because they are not held accountable and because, in fact, they make more money if they do that because people want to believe them. It's much more popular to say AI is amazing than it is to say that there are limits. And it's much easier to write a bestseller that says AI is going to be here next week. I mean, Kurzweil has done it and Ethan Mollick just did it and so forth. These promises don't turn out to be right. So that's the sort of abstract fabric. Talk is cheap. Nobody in the media really ever holds anybody responsible. At most, they're like, ha, 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 Elon's not always right. That's about as far as the accountability goes. I actually offered him, by the way, he recently said we'd have artificial general intelligence, AGI, by 2025. And I was tired of this. I wanted to hold him accountable. I offered him $1 million bet that it wouldn't happen. And he didn't respond. And then a friend of mine upped the bet to $10 million. And then the Wall Street Journal wrote to Musk's people and they didn't respond. Like he doesn't want to be accountable to these promises and the media mostly don't really hold. I mean, so, okay, the Wall Street Journal wrote to him that day, he didn't comment. But now, 6 months later, everybody's forgotten that he's made these ridiculous promises. So that's part of it. The other part of it is I made the specific prediction in 2022 that we would not get pure large language models to scale indefinitely. So what does scaling mean? Scaling is the leading hypothesis that's driving a $200 billion investment industry. And the idea is that you could plot on a chart, and this worked for a little while. You could plot on a chart the amount of compute that people used, or the amount of data that they used, and how good systems would do on certain benchmarks. And it was increasing exponentially for a while. And what I said is not going to last forever. And I wrote this article called Deep Learning is Hitting a Wall. And man, did I touch a nerve with that. So Sam Altman personally attacked me on Twitter, Greg Brockman, who was the CTO at the time of OpenAI, did. Later, Elon Musk attacked me on Twitter. Jan LeCun attacked me on Twitter, although he's changed his position since. So everybody was really, really mad. There were memes going around of Godzilla stepping over the wall. I mean, they were pretty funny. But I said, even though these things are pretty funny, it's not solving the intrinsic problems. So the intrinsic problems of hallucinations, for example, follow from all the stuff that I just described to you. So that was in this paper I wrote. And then earlier this year, I said, the moment has actually come. So there has not been much progress since GPT-4. So OpenAI has had a series of releases. The first one was called GPT. It's the worst name ever. It's hard to say, but we're stuck with it now. So then they released a better version called GPT-2. They trained it on more data. It did a bit better. I mean, it did a lot better, importantly, than the original GPT Classic, I'll call it, or GPT-1. And then they released GPT-3, and it was a lot better than GPT-2. And then they released GPT-4, and it was a lot better than GPT-3. And so people fantasize that you would continue indefinitely. But I like to think of the trillion-pound baby problem. Someone had this wonderful example, actually on Twitter, where they said, look, my baby was 3 pounds at birth, and a month later it's 6 pounds. So I've done the liberty of extrapolating. My baby's going to be 1 trillion pounds by the time he's 18. Of course, that's not really going to happen. You can't extrapolate trends indefinitely for different reasons in different domains. So, if you have one fly and it turns into, reproduces and has 2, and then you have 4 and 8 and so forth, that doesn't mean that suddenly the planet is going to be completely covered with flies because you run out of resources and so forth. So earlier this year, I said, hey, GPT-5 isn't really here. Right? Everybody was promising it. And there was a whole almost like cult of predictions. GPT-5 is going to be here. Like I remember the day before the Super Bowl in January, people were like, man, that's going to be amazing. OpenAI is going to drop GPT-5 right after the Super Bowl. They're going to have an ad. And like people had all of these fantasies. Someone described them as fan fiction. There's been a lot of fan fiction, but GPT-5 has not, in fact, dropped. And I started pointing this out. And then I saw some data, and I wrote a piece in my Substack in April saying, I think we've actually hit this period of diminishing returns. We're not actually getting better anymore. And again, kind of people laughed at me and put it aside or whatever. Ethan Mollick was slightly nicer. He was like, maybe Gary's not wrong, but it doesn't really look that way to me. That was about as warm as anybody got. And in the last month, everybody else's tune has changed. So first thing I think that happened was, well, I don't quite know the sequence, but in the last few weeks, Mark Andreessen, who's one of the biggest venture capitalists, basically said deep learning is hitting a wall. He used almost that phrase. He said, we're spending more money on GPU chips, but we're not getting increases in intelligence anymore. So for a while, more chips meant more intelligence. And that's just not really happening empirically anymore. And then there was a leak to The Information, which is a trade journal, saying that OpenAI was basically disappointed with their most recent results. And in fact, I think they tried to make GPT-5. And then instead, if you follow this, you'll see they have a bunch of other models called like GPT-4 Turbo and O1 and so forth. They're like avoiding calling anything that they're creating GPT-5 because they know if they called any of these new things GPT-5, people would be like, that's it. And so they'd be disappointed. It would really hurt the company. So I think they've taken a bunch of shots on goal and they all missed. And then someone else reported that Google is trying to train the next version of Gemini. It's apparently been disappointing. And some of the language that really stuck in my head is these things didn't meet the internal projections. So the internal projections were people took this curve, these scaling laws, and predicted if we do this much work, they haven't made public what they did, but if we did this much work, we would get this much benefit on these various benchmarks. And they're not actually finding it anymore. So we are, in fact, reaching this point of diminishing returns from everything that's been reported in the industry in the last month. There's probably multiple reasons for that. You can ask me about that. But the empirical fact is, I think that the jig is up, that we're not, we're getting little tiny improvements, but basically everybody is converging. We have like 7 or 10 companies converging on the same level of technology. It's a little bit better than GPT-4. I mean, it is measurably better. You can do the science on it and see that it's better, but it's not much better. It's not solving hallucinations. It's not solving what I like to call boneheaded errors. Like you still get these crazy, stupid errors, fairly regularly. And that has implications, right? Because everybody's been investing money thinking, well, these scaling laws will hold true indefinitely. and we'll just get to artificial general intelligence with enough data. And now I think people are seeing that that's not actually true. And then there's the secondary thing, which is if everybody converges on the same place, so everybody, all the players have similar models, then nobody has a moat by which business people talk about, like, I have a technology that you don't. So there are different kinds of moats, but if somebody had artificial general intelligence and nobody else did, that would be an enormous advantage. It would be really world changing. I mean, imagine that you have a computer that can do anything that a person can do and maybe do it better and so forth, and nobody else does. I mean, you could make trillions of dollars probably. But the reality is everybody has something that's a little bit better than GPT-4. And so why should you use OpenAI's product as opposed to Meta's product when Meta is giving theirs away free? And so from a business perspective, this kind of AI, which I don't think is the last word ever on AI, but the kind of AI that we have now and is popular, is basically a commodity. And that means that there are price wars, which have already launched. So prices have gone down, but the quality hasn't really gone up. So if everybody has a, kind of satisfying, but not entirely satisfying AI, why should you pay this company any more than that company? And that means that the money is going to run out, right? Because this is much more expensive than traditional software. Traditional software has huge profit margins. You write Microsoft Excel, it's expensive to write, but then you can distribute as many copies as you want, operating it, the user does it on their own computer, it costs you nothing. You just make more copies and you amortize the cost very quickly. With this kind of stuff, you have to have these huge clusters of GPUs, first of all, to update your system to keep current with current data and to keep current with the competition. And then every time you run a query. So, if you look at the math, such as we can get the numbers, OpenAI and all these companies are losing money every time they run a query. So they're losing money and they have to cut prices. I mean, it's almost like a bad joke. Like, what's the good news and what's the bad news? Like, we're losing money and we have to cut prices. Like, this is a terrible combination.
Yeah. Right. Well, most of us in this room are students and educators, and obviously we're also all citizens, global citizens. And so we're sort of in a damned if we do, damned if we don't kind of situation, in that we want to put, say, AI tools to productive use. We want our students to learn about these things. We want everybody, and our students, of course, want to be ready as the sort of workforce of the future. And so, sort of, there's an attitude, sort of almost tech positive attitude, I would say, sort of, to actually want to use these products. And then on the other hand, yeah, I mean, there are all these potential risks and harms and reliability problems. And so, and again, this is affecting us in the education sector for sure, but it's, I think, affecting everybody in all industries. So where do we go from here then?
It's a difficult question. I sort of have a narrow answer, but not a full answer. So the narrow answer is what I've recommended to faculty is let your students use it, because the students should understand the strengths and limitations. And that will be true for the current generation of AI, and it'll be true for future generations of AI. AI will continue to evolve, and it will be good for students to understand what is it good for, when can I not trust it, and so forth. So I recommended this a bunch of times in the media, that you should let your students use it, but then discuss the output for a couple of reasons. One is to see all the hallucinations and so forth. And the other is to see from a writing perspective, the writing is really usually mediocre and uninteresting. And so you can say, well, okay, this is what ChatGPT or whatever wrote. How could you make this more interesting to someone else? So there was a tweet by somebody who tried. He said, I tried out the Gary Marcus method, which is what I just described. And his tweet went completely viral, and I'll tell you why it went completely viral. It's because he said, I tried it out. I think it was on 63 students, and every one of the 63 students found some hallucination in what the large language model had produced. And that was such a crazy result that I think 9 million people viewed this on Twitter. So that is my recommendation, is let people use it. They're going to use it. Prohibition never works for anything that I can think of. And so I wouldn't bother to do that, but I would try to turn it into a teachable moment, as they say, and try to learn and understand it. I would also say to the students, if you do have ChatGPT writing your papers, you're not going to learn as much. And, people come to school for different reasons, but hopefully one of them is in fact to learn. And, if the system just writes this thing, you're not going to evaluate the information as deeply. You're not going to learn it as well. One of the most basic findings in cognitive psychology is what they call depths of processing. So the more deeply you process information, the more you learn from it, the longer it sticks with you. So like, there are reasons to want to save time, and I understand that as someone who is perpetually overworked, but there are also reasons to want to actually learn the material. And if you want to have a job after you are in college, the skills that you might gain are valuable. And there's a certain way in which you're shortcutting your education if you use it. So, I mean, it's a complicated thing. The other thing to say is we're in 2024, and I would say that in 2050, they'll look at the AI we have now and laugh at it the way that we laugh at the car-sized cell phones that you sometimes see in old movies. They're like all excited. It's a plot point. He's got a phone in his car. Oh my God. And it's like, yay big and right. And so we laugh at that stuff. We will, 25 years from now, laugh at the AI that we have now. But it is an important part of the lives of any students in this room that AI is going to constantly change in the coming decades. And, it's going to be valuable to have the skill to move with that, to understand the current state of the art and as it changes and so forth.
All right. I want to talk more about AI, perhaps with time permitting, we'll do that. But this book is also a call for action. And, whenever we were talking about it, we had a reading group this morning to talk about your book, and the one question that kept coming up is politics. There was another way you could have received
Did we have an election a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, there was another way you could get $1 million from Elon Musk.
Well,
So that happened. How does that?
Well, I mean, first I'll give you a little background. I wrote this book faster than any book I've written. I've written 6. I wrote this book in 2 months, and I wrote it out of rage and terror. And the notion was I wanted to get the book out before the election because I felt like we were at a choice point in American history. The EU has done something already to protect its citizens from AI, but the United States hasn't. And I had a front row seat because I testified in front of the US Senate a year and a half ago next to Sam Altman. And I spoke with a lot of senators on camera and off, and all the senators seemed enthusiastic about doing something around AI. But I could tell by the time November came around of last year that they weren't actually going to do anything. It was my read that there was going to be a lot of talk and no action. Not the first time in the history of Washington that might have happened. But that was my read. And I felt like we needed to get people to understand before the election that there was this fundamental choice point. I tried not to make the book overtly political in the sense of I didn't, for example, endorse the Democrats versus the Republicans, although you could probably tell from reading it where I might land on that. But I wanted people to talk. I wanted to get the book out quickly so that people might talk about it during the election. In that sense, it was a complete, utter failure. I mean, I did get like on television a few times or whatever, but I was not able to get the public to think about this. AI came up once in the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. She mentioned it once. That was it. That was the only time practically that AI was mentioned in the presidential campaign. I don't think it was mentioned in many campaigns for Senate either. So people basically ignored it. My view is this would be like ignoring the pandemic in late 2019. Like December 2019, we knew something was happening in China and we all pretended it wasn't. So what's happening now is that we are in the process of deciding what the legal and cultural norms are around AI in the United States. And once those things get set, they tend not to change. So we saw that with social media, right? Social media, the Congress didn't do anything very quickly. We landed on this thing called Section 230 that gives companies basically blanket immunity for anything they post, which was okay when they were just posting stuff, but not okay when they started building things like Facebook Newsfeed, because Facebook Newsfeed basically prioritized misinformation, not intentionally, but by virtue of wanting to popularize the things that got people to use Facebook the most, that allowed them to sell the most ads. And it turns out misinformation pisses people off, and they get mad and they spread it. And they put a lot of effort into it. So there are actually studies around this showing that misinformation travels faster in social media than correct information. We could have, as a society, said that's not good. We're going to put some constraint around it. But instead, we said, go ahead, knock yourself out. And we saw how, Elon Musk took advantage of that, for example, in the most recent election campaign on X. He felt free, because there was no consequence whatsoever, to put as much misinformation as he wanted and to prioritize it however he wanted. And there's no legal recourse around that at all.
And well, not to darken the mood or anything, but so perhaps now is the first time when sort of a group of tech billionaires who have advocated against technology regulation, not just any specific regulation, but regulation as such, have the upper hand and have the president's ear, might actually take up government positions or government-like positions in their sort of near future. So what does that say about the future of technology regulation, especially legal regulation?
I mean, it's complicated but dark is my take on it. So Elon Musk himself is a very interesting character in all of this, because he was one of the first people to really take seriously the notion that AI could get out of control and kill us all. I don't think it's very likely that AI will literally kill us all, but I think it is reasonably likely that we may build AI systems that we poorly control. In fact, we don't control large language models very well. It kind of cracked me up. I saw what they call the system prompt for Apple's new software. And the system prompt says, don't hallucinate. But the system doesn't understand the command, don't hallucinate. So it still hallucinates, even though it's told not to, right? So there's a famous movie where there's a line, we have a failure to communicate, right? We have a failure to communicate with our AI systems. They don't really understand what we're saying. They're just doing, again, the statistical analysis. So there have been system prompts like, don't use copyrighted materials, don't hallucinate. They don't understand this. So that's a small version of what we call the alignment problem. And I'm going to come back to Musk in a second. The alignment problem is basically, how do you get AI to behave consistently with human values? And some of them can include don't use copyrighted material. And some of them might have a little bit more at stake than that, though that has a lot at stake if you're an artist. But some of them might be like, don't kill people. And we don't know how to guarantee that these systems won't. So there are, for example, bits of software that we can formally verify, that we can prove will do this given a certain set of circumstances. So Windows uses these for device drivers. So Windows used to crash all the time, and the main reason it doesn't, from what I understand anymore, is they use formal software verification techniques on device drivers. Airplane designs for large commercial jets use a lot of formal verification in different components and so forth. But you can't do that with AI writ large. We can only do that in these little narrow problems. So I don't think machines are going to kill us all, but Elon actually does think that machines may kill us all. And so there's as in many issues, there's two sides to Elon. There is the side of Elon that is genuinely concerned about this issue. As far as I know, he has one academic publication, and it's on AI risk, and it's around 2014. So he really does worry about this. And at the same time, he wants to promote his own interests. So in about a year and a half ago, there was this famous pause letter asking for a moratorium on training GPT-5, which we could talk about if you want. But he actually both signed that letter, which had only one request. It wasn't to stop AI research altogether. It actually said, do more AI research on AI safety, but don't train this one system that might be, really out of control. He signed this letter, and we said, don't do it for 6 months. Let's spend 6 months as a, scientific community to try to figure out how to make this stuff safe. And at the same time, he was building a GPU cluster for his own AI company called XDA, which he released almost 6 months to the day after he signed the pause letter. I mean, you could not see a more schizophrenic response than that. And so here he is, He's not an official government employee. He doesn't want to be because he would have to divest, his stocks, which he's certainly not going to do. But he has, the ear of the president, and he's not internally consistent about that. So, the biggest thing that we can actually say about the Trump administration, I think, on almost every dimension is that it's unpredictable. And that's partly because many of the people that he's listening to are themselves unpredictable.
All right. So to add a little bit more order, predictability, and hope to our lives, you talk about genuinely trustworthy AI. And I know that a lot of your research basically wants to bring in approaches to AI that are not necessarily machine learning or deep learning based, but ones that sort of use maybe sort of the systems that are like symbolic or propositional logic in nature. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? How that kind of AI could potentially improve what we have now?
Yes. First, I make a clarification, though. A lot of people think that I want to eliminate deep learning altogether. And that's a straw man. And Jan LeCun at Meta likes to straw man me and say Marcus wants to get rid of deep learning altogether. And I never, ever say that. And whenever it comes up, I clarify as I'm doing now. I think we should keep deep learning, but I don't think we should rely on it solely. I think that we need other techniques too. So I think we should think of deep learning as like a power screwdriver. Like it's a fabulous tool, but that doesn't mean you build a whole house with a power screwdriver. You also want to have like a hammer, and you want to have, architectural plans, and you want to have a plane, and et cetera. So, and if you're doing the electrical work, you want a voltmeter. So deep learning is, I think, one tool among many. If you think about how human cognition works, part of what we do is, in fact, to statistically analyze the world. But part of what we do is to reason. Some people will know Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And he argued there for what he called System 1 and System 2. And System 1 is basically fast, reflexive, statistical. And System 2 is more like deliberate reasoning, abstraction, and so forth. Deep learning is basically like Kahneman's System 1, and classical AI is kind of like Kahneman's System 2. And it's obvious that humans use both and balance them, sometimes perfectly, sometimes, as you know from my book, Klugh, imperfectly. But we use both of these systems, and it's part of, I think, what makes us sophisticated. In fact, a lot of what makes humans more sophisticated than other creatures is the System 2 stuff. So I think it should be obvious, but sociologically it has not been. It should be obvious that what we should be working on is combining those two, trying to take the tools of classical AI that give us some purchase on reasoning abstractly and combine that with deep learning. Sociologically, it's all about like grants and influence and so forth. And for 40 years, the people working on these two approaches have kind of hated each other, fought over graduate students, fought over grant money, said mean things to each other. And so the sociology has been that people basically commit to one or the other. And I think that's really held us back.
All right, thank you. I am anxious to open up to the audience questions. I just have one last question, a little bit off topic, but from one guitar aficionado to another. So how did learning how to play the guitar, what did it teach you about how the mind works, how the human sort of learning process works?
So I wrote a book on a sabbatical about learning to play guitar at the age of 40. And it was a really interesting process to work on something that I wasn't good at and see that even as an adult that I could do that at all. And it was very interesting to like learn about music theory and try understand all of the things that go into a skill like learning to play guitar. A lot of professional musicians really enjoyed the book and like gave it to their family and so forth because it explained all of the steps that are involved. I never became a great guitar player. I did get to play with some great guitar players, like kind of on the book tour. I got to play with Vernon Reid and Gary Lucas and Terry Roach and stuff like that. So I had, a really good time with it. I was never on the level, but I learned enough that I could kind of improvise with other people, at least a little bit. And I enjoyed that. I don't think it taught me anything about AI, but it did teach me something about human psychology.
All right, yeah, we'll bring you back here for a jam. All right, let's take some questions. All right.
Hi, Juan Reyes, English department here. One of the things that I've been doing in my creative writing classes especially is sort of like engaging with AI and creativity. And one of the questions that keeps popping up is how similar it seems that sites like character.ai, for example, are geared on user engagement in the same way that social media algorithms are, right? And I was just wondering your take on sort of the danger, right, of generating or like essentially researching and reproducing this stuff with the explicit intent to just keep you engaged and what that might mean for future AI development.
I mean, there's definitely some commonalities between social media and these apps. I mean, there are many different ways you can use chatbots, but they were designed to appear human-like in order to suck people in. So probably the most brilliant thing that OpenAI did was to have ChatGPT type out things word by word. You know, it didn't need to do that. In fact, every time it did that, it probably had a list of words and it is picking them one by one with some constant for how long to wait to do the next word. It's not that it's actually computing it word by word in that fashion. I mean, they could, I suppose, do it the latter way, but they did that to give the illusion that it is a person. Now, some of the applications are people are interacting with these things as if they are lovers, therapists, and so forth. As a side note, OpenAI, I think, is going to monetize some of that. They're going to sell your personal data. And I think it makes, both because the company itself is vulnerable and because the company may need to do that in order to actually make profits. Everything that you type in, you should assume is not really as private as you might like it to be. And there is this same kind of weaponization as we saw in social media. So of course, people are trying to make the chatbots, as much fun to play with and so forth. An interesting empirical question we really have to do studies on is what are the long-term effects of talking to a chatbot all day long, which some people are doing. It reminds me of an old study that I mentioned in the book Kluge about television watching. It feels a little dated because people don't watch as much television anymore because they're sitting on their phones doing social media. But back in the day when I was younger, some people would watch like 5 hours a day of television. Some people would watch a lot less. And the studies showed that the people who watch 5 hours a day of television were less happy than the people who watch 2 hours a day of television. And you could ask, there's different causal mechanisms. Causality is always hard to infer, but the assumption that I always made, I didn't do the work to prove it, but my guess was always that part of that was actually about what an economist would call opportunity costs. If you spend 5 hours a day inside watching television, then you can't do other things like make friends. And friends actually tend to keep us happy. And the television programs, I think, give a fleeting pleasure, but they don't give an enduring, lasting pleasure. And so I suspect the same thing is going to happen, but I don't have the data. Nobody has the data yet. But I suspect the same thing is going to happen with people who spend an entire day interacting with chatbot is in the moment, they feel less lonely, which is a good thing, right? We have a loneliness epidemic. But in the long run, they're not developing social skills. They're not developing relationships. And I think it's sort of like a one-way ticket in a way. And so I do worry about it. That said, it is like an empirical question. We have to actually do the studies to find out. I don't think we're going to be able to interdict it and say you can't do it. I hope that we'll find out, whether my dark projection is right. My dark projections have a tendency to be right, but There's a mic right up front.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, how do you see AI sort of changing people and changing society? And by that, I mean like, fire caused the human body, the human intestines to, grow shorter. GPS is sort of atrophying people's ability to know directions and be able to just maneuver around sort of thing. Like, how do you see AI affecting people like that?
First thing to probably say is that there's many different forms of AI, and the story is going to be different for each. Many of them are dual use, like fire, right? Fire has its advantages, it has its disadvantages. And many of these technologies are probably like that. Like if people could use chatbots to keep themselves from being lonely, but keep it to 20 minutes a day, I just made up that number, but hypothetically, maybe that would be a good thing. And if they used it for 5 hours a day because it becomes addictive, maybe that's a bad thing. Like many other things in life. So getting people to moderate their behavior around these things is often very difficult. But I think different uses of AI have different consequences for the social fabric. So the fact that people are using AI to make decisions about job candidates, which ones to interview, is going to be really bad for anybody who isn't a white male, because they tend to perpetuate past bias and they don't understand values like don't discriminate or laws like don't discriminate. And so, that's an example where one consequence is, I think, going to be bad discrimination. It's going to set us back, probably 40 years in a way. So, that's one kind of consequence. There'll be other consequences. So, my favorite use of AI is AlphaFold, which is not a chatbot, but is trying to predict the 3D structure of a protein. David Baker across the way shared a Nobel Prize with DeepMind for having developed this technology. That's a pretty great technology. I don't think it has a lot of downsides. It's not pretending to be all things. It's doing this one problem pretty well. I don't think it's going to hurt everyday individuals. That's a good use of AI, and there's going to be many that are positive, many that are negative. Some we can't even predict yet. I mean, generative AI has only really been part of the culture for 2 years. Every day somebody finds a new good use and a new bad use. The bad actors are spending a lot of time trying to figure out, how can we run scams with this stuff? And the good actors are like, how can we make this a better teacher? And the effects are going to be really broad. It's the ChatGPT is kind of like a jack of all trades and master of none. And we're going to have to look at each of those many, many trades individually to see what effects they have on society.
Hi, thank you. I'm Yasmin Sari in philosophy, and I have dragged some of my students from the class today on ethics and introduction to philosophy, where we talk about critical thinking a lot. So thank you for your beautiful conversation. And I want to bring back the question to democracy and the downfall or how AI perhaps can contribute or propel the downfall of democracy, as was suggested in the little blurb for the conversation today. So 2 things to speak to your points, to bring back the points about just using generative AI when you don't have, you haven't mastered the knowledge or the repertoire, if you will. So this is something from the classroom setting, for instance, for students. Most of the time, students don't know what they don't know. And this is a question, like when they ask certain questions to get answers from a ChatGPT or bot, it becomes difficult, of course, to be able to assess that. So that's one problem that may be one for educators, etc. But in the public sphere, where we all are in a democratic state of sorts. The question is about, as you suggested, is one of responsibility and the ability to reason and judge. The one thing that I'm curious about and that I always try to, if you will, convey to my students and others is that our equal ability to judge is a very recent phenomenon. It's pretty new, that this was recognized. Not that we have the capacity to reason, but that we could equally judge and self-govern and make determinations for our own life. Make decisions, if you will. So be part of a demos, be part of a democracy. So to me, if we, and the example that you gave about the job interviews or job, if you will, screenings is a beautiful one that would definitely perpetuate the biases that we already have and the structural injustices in place that are right now done by humans. But on another hand, if it comes to a point of outsourcing our judgment, our ability to judge to any type of, if you will, artificial intelligence, what do you would you speak to that a little bit? What would be that loss? Of course, there's a loss of responsibility, but a loss of actual, if you will, genuine ability to be in a democracy is what I'm thinking of. And would you, on the other hand, because I wouldn't want us to just think of grim things, what is one hope that you have for the future that we can maybe elaborate on? Thank you.
I think that might have been the bomb cyclone asking us to wrap up, or maybe not. So I guess I have a few responses. The first is I'll say something you didn't say, but in general sphere, which is the lifeblood of democracy is information. If you don't have good information, you can't make good judgments. And one of the most problematic uses of large language models is to create propaganda. We don't have good data on how much this is happening, but we know it's happening. So the US government reported some interventions by Russia, for example, in the election that were generated by large language models. So, if we have bad information or people don't trust anything anymore, which seems to be where we're headed, that makes democracy really, really hard. That's the first thing I'll say. The second is, I hope people won't outsource their judgment to AI, but they might. We have a history of people attributing to AI more intelligence than is there. That goes back to 1965 with Eliza, which was a very simple-minded psychiatrist that would just look for keywords like sister or mother, or like say, tell me more about your family if it saw the word sister, like crazy, stupid stuff. But some people would talk to it anyway and attribute intelligence to it. I mean, like, look, people, had pet rocks for a while. Like human beings are very happy to attribute intelligence where it is not actually present. And so people are attributing judgment to these systems, even though they're not really doing that. And people's skills at judgment may atrophy. People's critical skills may atrophy. I think you're right to be worried about that. My fantasy is that AI will actually help us with that. So you mentioned again my book Kluge, which is about the limitations of human reasoning in no small part. And I think we can do much better. Daniel Kahneman and I mentioned him before, were on a panel once, and he said something like, humans are a low bar. And I said, I agree, having written this book, but it's a wonder that we haven't beat it yet with AI. At some point we might, and the optimistic note would be if we could find a way of dealing with the limitations of human reasoning. I'll just name a couple. One is confirmation bias. So we notice evidence in favor of our own theories, but we tend not to notice evidence that doesn't support our own theories. And motivated reasoning, which is a related but distinct thing, which is we reason out of a temptation to protect our own ego and so forth. So for example, when data on cigarette smoking first came out, smokers would say, yeah, but something else might kill me. And so they kind of dismiss the evidence and so forth, which is true. Something else might kill you, but you might get lung cancer. It's really not so great to smoke the cigarettes. So if you could use AI to fill in and to help people where the reasoning is poor, and I don't think that's inconceivable, though it's unlikely with the current technology, but with some future technology, maybe that would be a really good thing. You could imagine kind of the equivalent of a life coach helping you through your decisions, saying, look, have you really considered all the angles here? Or are you just basically trying to talk yourself into this? Let's go through the steps. And I think that's within the domain of things that I think AI will be able to do someday. I don't really expect to be alive for it. I think it's going to take a while, but I do think that that's possible and it will help. And if we still have a democracy in this country in reality and not just in name, then maybe people will even get counseling on their votes or something like that there, and maybe that will have some utility. But that's not happening soon.
Or that either. So my name is Maisie Storm. I'm her student. But I'm also a criminal justice major aspiring to be a police officer. And there's already been research and implementations of AI in multiple sections of recording, analysis, facial analysis. But there's been false promises, as you even said in your discussions as well. And one of the things I want your opinion on is with those false promises given to police departments, the FBI agency, saying that we have all this technology, but we don't use it, or the super secret thing that the FBI uses and will never disclose of, which is a different subject. How do you think people like me who are going into their career afraid that we might have these unconscious biases in AI and we don't want to use them in our arresting and our
I mean,
all those?
I think it's good if people like you go into law enforcement, because
Thank you.
law enforcement doesn't have enough people that have any sophistication about AI, and doesn't tend to have people maybe that care about those kinds of issues. I think that there's a bias in law enforcement to like get the arrest rates up and get the crime rates down, but a useful concept from psychology is signal detection theory, where you're always trading off false alarms and hits and correct positives and so forth. And you have a bias, and so like, sure, you can get the arrest rate up, but you're going to falsely arrest some people, which, you know, we hope in this country not to do. And so you're always you know, playing with the parameters to try to get that right. I think it's great if bright young people go into law enforcement and think about that, think about hype in AI and try to speak against it. So like, yeah, your face recognition works most of the time, but what does most of the time mean here? If it means, you know, 97% of the time, that means like 3 out of 100 people that you're hauling in here are not guilty. Like, we need to think this through. So, you know, keep up the good fight,
Yeah.
learn to be skeptical about AI. You can read my Substack as one way to do that, but that there are others. There's a bunch of us trying to write about these kinds of things and bring that to the inside. Like, we have people on the outside complaining. It'd be great to have some people on the inside taking these issues seriously.
And then one more question. Am I close enough? For people who also are already using the AI, how do we not just rely on AI, but also use our conscious knowledge and use the evidence appropriately without just relying on AI?
I mean, in a way, I call that a problem of AI literacy. We need to get the word out. It's part of why I do these talks. You get people to realize that these systems are just not that sophisticated and should not be a substitute for human judgment. In fact, all the best applications of generative AI are really ones where there's a human clearly in the loop. So probably the single best one is brainstorming. You say, give me 10 ideas about X, and 8 of them are stupid, and one of them, you know, you kind of knew but hadn't thought about in a while, and it helps you remember that or whatever. And so you just, like, as part of natural course of using it for brainstorming, you rule that out. And the worst cases are like, people, you know, have it write an article about somebody. It makes mistakes, but people's eyes glaze over because it's all grammatical, and they just assume, you know, it looks good enough to me, and it's not actually good enough. So, you know, we need to teach people to keep their eye on the ball when they use this stuff. And it's hard because the content is grammatical, it's well formed, it's written in this authoritative style that I call authoritative bullshit. And so like, people believe it, and it takes discipline to be skeptical about it. So use that discipline and teach other people.
I will try. Thank you.
I guess one more and then we'll wrap up. Oh, you were waiting. We'll do 2 more. Weren't you waiting to ask? You waive your opportunity. You have the right to remain silent.
We can take 2 more, so maybe like we can take one after the other and then we can respond to both of them. Yeah.
Sure, we can do 2 more if there are 2 more people. That want.
Max.
Last 2.
So hi, my name is Max. I'm a 3rd-year computer science student here at Seattle University. I think I'm actually, I'm curious about hearing more about maybe some of your work in this space, especially on the side of maybe the education side and linguistics side, especially for, have there been places or directions you've seen in research in the field where we're actually bringing in maybe newer neuroscience and more formal linguistics into the deep learning, rather than just scaling things like you talked about we're doing with transformers?
Sadly, not so much. So there's an argument that deep learning is inspired by an idea from 1950s neuroscience.
Old neuroscience.
Which is basically hierarchies of feature detectors. There's not a lot of new neuroscience in there. That's partly the neuroscientist's fault, because, and then I'm going to get to linguistics, because the neuroscientists still haven't figured out how the brain works. And so it's not totally obvious what to bring in. In fact, my view is that we need to make AI better in order to figure out neuroscience. A lot of people assume it's the other way around, that we'll figure out more neuroscience, we'll make the AI better. I think understanding the brain is an incredibly difficult task. You know, 86 billion neurons and, you know, trillions of connections between them. And who knows what's happening at the protein level and so forth. I don't think it's realistic that we're going to understand the brain anytime soon. And we probably need much smarter AI to help us to navigate all of that. But whatever we have figured out in neuroscience is not really percolating into neural networks. And I think there's an ego problem. The neural networks people are very good at math and have made a lot of money. And so they're not really listening to anybody else. Now I will turn to the linguistics part. The current way in which we build AI doesn't really allow you to insert linguistics any more than it allows you to insert, you know, don't hallucinate. So abstract knowledge just doesn't fit well with these giant models of statistical data. So you can't take ideas from linguistics and really stick them in formally. The most basic idea from linguistics is that sentences have meanings independent of their syntax, so semantics independent of the syntax. And that's not well captured by the current systems. They've just sort of given up on that. In my Substack, I have an essay, which I think is called 7 Ideas from Linguistics that AI should incorporate or something like that. It's co-written with Elliot Murphy. And, you know, there's just a lot of basic ideas from linguistics that aren't really compatible with deep learning as we know it now, and should be motivation for doing other stuff. But because of the weird economic incentives and so forth, nobody's really trying to do that. So I think we'll get linguistics in there before we get neuroscience in, but it's going to require some innovation that we don't have yet. And I'll take one last question.
I hope this isn't like a super personal question, but is there anything specific that you would tell your children going into the workforce? Are there any like main questions to have like in your back pocket when choosing a specific field?
I don't quite know what to tell them. The honest truth is that the field has not done a great job of predicting what's going to happen next. I think I personally have done a good job of anticipating the limitations of current systems, but on the whole, our track records aren't great. So, you know, famously, Jeff Hinton said we might as well stop training radiologists in 2016. And here we are 8 years later, and not one radiologist has been replaced by an AI, because it turns out that what a radiologist does is more complicated than just look at an image. So the AI is good at looking at the image, but it's not good at reading the charts and understanding what's going on. Another example where a lot of people were wrong, although they may be right eventually, was many people thought that by 2024 that taxi drivers wouldn't have jobs anymore. And the number of taxi drivers replaced by AI is like 7 or something like that. I don't know. And is, you know, there's some Ubers running. I mean, some Waymos running in San Francisco. And now I guess they've done like 1 million rides or something like that. But that's not that many drivers that actually been replaced. And on the other hand, I don't think anybody in 2015 or 14 or whatever was predicting that voiceover actors basically no longer had a profession. And it turns out that they don't. We don't really need voiceover actors anymore. You know, some people that are famous, they have contracts and the legal protections, may keep doing it. So George Clooney has a familiar voice and he may get a deal. But in general, like voice over acting is done. And so it's like we got all that wrong. And so I'm reluctant to tell you and reluctant to tell my own children exactly where all this is going to land, except to be creative, have good critical thinking skills, be a quick learner, and that's going to be helpful in society. But we don't really know how all of this is going to play out. And I think we should probably end there. Sorry not to have clear advice on what you should do with your life.
Right, everyone, I feel that this is a conversation that everybody in the world needs to have, and I am so proud as director of Seattle U's Technology Ethics Initiative, as faculty here, to have had it here. Thank you so much for all being here, and above all, thank you, Professor Marcus, for being here and sharing your wisdom and insights with us.
Very much.